Martin William Smith College in Geneva, out in the beautiful Finger Lakes. So her recent works, 2016's Crowd in the Party, and then very recently, which she's going to be talking about today, 2019's Comrade. It really challenges us to try to think about how we organize for power in contemporary, as the term you used earlier, communicative capitalism. And you know, we see on the one hand the capacities for people to express their political interest, to take sort of quick political actions have just exploded dramatically. On the other hand, and I think this is rather an argument that you make, is that our capacity to achieve real power through that is perhaps diminished, or certainly at least not enhanced. And I think that is the challenge that she is posing for us as activists, as leftists, who are organizing for power. And in particular, trying to, and I've always appreciated about her work, is actually looking at these moments when the left did organize for power into things like party organizations and develop these real structures to bring people together, develop platforms, movements, and organize, I guess, with a capital O. So with that said, please join me in welcoming Jodi Dean.
Thanks so much for coming out tonight. Thanks so much to John for inviting me. I'm really happy to be back. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Good. Then I'll do this rather than worrying about the mic. So what I'm going to do tonight is introduce some of the ideas from the book Comrade. And my remarks have three parts. So first, what I'm going to do, I'll just explain the term. I'll give us some sort of definitions and history, etymology. Then I'm going to compare comradeship with other kinds of political belonging. So we can contrast it, see what's similar, see what's different. And then I'm going to make an argument for advancing the notion of comradeship on the left over and against allyship, right? So I'm going to give a critique of the idea of the ally and allyship and what it means, and embrace this idea of the comrade and try to explain why it's important for the left now. So if I begin etymologically, right, in the history of language, in Romance languages, comrade first appears in the 16th century, and it designates a room that, and it designates one person who shares a room with another, right? If you share a room with another, you're comrades. In French, the term was originally feminine, camarade, and it referred to a barracks, or a room shared by soldiers. In Spanish, and this is according to a linguistic dictionary, camarada is someone who is so close to another man that he eats and sleeps in the same house with him. Comrade derives from the Latin word camera, which means root, chamber, and vault. So the technical connotation of vault gives us this sense, this technical connotation indexes a kind of generic function, right? It indexes this function of producing a structure that holds open a particular space, right? It makes the space, it holds it open. It's like, it makes us think of comradeship as like a relationship of supported cover. There's an inside, there's an outside, and there's a structure of support. So if we go, again, going back to this idea of the vault or room, a chamber is a repeatable structure, and it takes its form by being producing an inside as opposed to an outside, and this supported cover. So I'm going to, build a lot from this kind of metaphor, like thinking about what it means to be on one side rather than the other within this relation of supported cover. Also, we can see from this etymology that sharing a room or sharing a space generates a kind of closeness. It generates an intensity of feeling and expectation of solidarity that differentiates those on one side from those or another, right? It's not just being in the space, but there's a way that being in the space works back on people to make them feel a sense of some kind of solidarity with one another. So this etymology then lets us define comrade as a generic figure for the political relation between those on the same side of a political struggle. Right? It's a generic name for those on the same side of a political struggle. Comrades are those who tie themselves together instrumentally. It's an instrumental relation for a common purpose. Like we're together not for our own benefit, but for a common purpose. Because if we want to win, and we have to act together. Right? That's why we're doing it. We're doing it. We become comrades in order to win. We become comrades because we think that it's important to be in relation, not for its own sake, but for the sake of the struggle. Now, the term comrade functions in three ways. First, as a term of address. Second, as a carrier of expectations. And third, as a form of political belonging. And I'll talk a little bit about these three. As a term of address, comrade replaces gendered and hierarchical designations with an egalitarian one. And so as comrades, we're all the same, right? So it's not the same as like, oh, you know, Professor Dean, blah, 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 right, which is hierarchical, or, you know, oh, Mrs. Johnson, right, which is gendered. Now we've got comrade, which is not gendered and not hierarchical. Correspondingly, those who are comrades share a set of expectations for one another, right? There's a kind of egalitarianness of the expectations, right? Comrades have to be able to count on one another, even if they don't like each other, and even when they disagree, right? If you're comrades, whether or not you like each other, that shouldn't make a difference at all, right? Because what matters is the action that you're engaged in. In the book, Romance of American Communism by Vivian Gornick, and I actually have to go off script here and thank John Flanders. He's the person who gave me that book years ago, and I mean, it's changed my life. I love it. I really, it's actually being reissued by Verso in February, and so they'll plug for that. Anyway, in the Romance of American Communism, Vivian Gornick reports on the words of a former member of the CP who really hated the daily grind of selling the Daily Worker and having to go canvassing all the time. But then she says, but nevertheless I did it. I did it because if I didn't do it, I couldn't face my comrades the next day. And we all did it for the same reason. We were accountable to each other. Finally, the third notion of comradeship, or the third aspect of the term, it points to a relation of political belonging. And here it's not the same, it really differs from a term like militant, right? Because militant designates an individual's political intensity, right? If you're a militant, that's the way, it's like it refers to something very specific. In contrast, comrade refers to the relation between or among militants. And so it's necessarily collective and shared. So that's the explanation then for the term. Right? It's a generic figure for the relation between those on the same side of a political struggle, and a whole lot follows from this. Namely, shared expectations for action and a relation of political equality. It's going to be worth dwelling on this egalitarian element some more, because in the socialist and communist traditions, that's where the liberating and utopian dimension of the term comes from. Now, my slides weirdly screwed up my transition, so let me go back here. Okay, so now what I'm going to try to bring out is this egalitarian aspect of the term comrade. I'm going to bring this out really, I'm focusing on the communist and socialist tradition, and I want to associate this with some of the utopian aspects. And I'll begin here with the Bolshevik revolutionary Alexandra Kollontai, who pointed out that capitalism tears people apart, making them competitive, self-interested, and afraid. Communism abolishes these conditions and creates new ones, where all workers are comrades above all else. I mean, I'm summarizing Kollontai here. For Kollontai, then, comradeship is a mode of belonging characterized by equality, solidarity, and respect. Collectivity replaces isolation, egoism, and self-assertion. It makes people capable of freedom. The Russian word for comrade, but at least half the people in here know it, right? Tovarish, is masculine, yet its power is such that it actually liberates people from the chains of grammar, right? The same term, even with its masculine ending, is used for female comrades. There's a Soviet book on literary language that was published in 1929, and it's trying to deal with all the new revolutionary terms. And it gives the example, like to show how kind of radical the language was, and how radically the language was changing. It uses the example of comrade sister. because it sounds so weird in Russian because it's a masculine adjective modifying now a feminine noun, but it doesn't change, right? Because the revolution is so strong that gendered grammar breaks down and you don't have to have it, right? So it evokes the emancipatory ideals of the revolution itself. The Soviet writer Maxim Gorky also associates comradeship with liberation. And he has a short story called Comrade. It was published in the U.S. journal, sort of a glossy magazine called Comrade in I think it's like 1903, 1904. And so that was when the English version was published. And in this short story called Comrade, like 3 different layers, Gorky presents comrade as a word that, quote, had come to unite the whole world, to lift all men up the summits of liberty and bind with new ties, the strong ties of mutual respect. Now his story depicts a city of hostility, violence, humiliation, and rage, where the weak submit to the dominance of the strong. And in the midst of all this horrible suffering, one word rings out, comrade. And the people cease to be slaves. They refuse to submit. They become conscious of their strength. They recognize that they themselves are the force of life. I mean, honestly, the story is like totally over the top, but it actually makes it really, really wonderful. I'm not like, that's not my like rhetorical excess here, right? This is like Gorky just totally off the deep end. Anyway, so one of his examples is the prostitute, and she's cold, weary, in the dark city streets. And she feels a hand on her shoulder. And then she weeps with joy as she turns around and hears the word, comrade. With this word, she is addressed not as a commodity to be used by another, but as an equal in common struggle against the very conditions requiring commodification. In Gorky's story, then, comrade marks the division between the world of misery we have and the egalitarian communist world that will be. Frantz Fanon, the revolutionary and philosopher from Martinique, who participated in the Algerian liberation struggle, also brings out the egalitarian and utopian dimension of comrade. In his conclusion to Wretched of the Earth, Fanon appeals repeatedly to his readers as comrades. He writes, "Come, comrades, the European game is finally over. We must look for something else." And in the very last line of the book, he writes, "For Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must make a new start, develop a new way of thinking, and endeavor to create a new man." Comrade is the mode of address appropriate to this task. It's egalitarian, generic, and in the context of hierarchy, fragmentation, and oppression, utopian. It's an invitation to a common project. Because I love these examples, and I think turning to these historical examples can help give us strength and inspire us now. I'm going to use one more from the 1930s Communist Party of the United States. Now, as we know, the CPUSA was not always successful in its struggle to eliminate bigotry and in their language, white chauvinism. But it did embrace an egalitarian ideal of comradeship. The Black Communist Labor organizer, Ernst Rice McKinney, tells a story about leaving a meeting in Pittsburgh. And this story is quoted by, I'm getting it from Mark Nason in an article that he published in Science and Society. So here's the story from Ernst Rice McKinney. "We were walking down the street, black and white together, and there were some black men walking with a white woman. We were in a tough working class district, and as we passed a group of white youth, they said to us, 'Hello, comrades.' Their tone was sarcastic, but not hostile. They assumed we were communist, because the communists had made such an impression by practicing social equality." So McKinney's story brings home the way the term comrade carried, even for those who weren't comrades, expectations for practical action, actions that demonstrated full commitment to full equality. Comradeship manifests in deeds. And again, U.S. communists weren't always successful in practicing social equality. Nonetheless, the expectation of comrades, which was powerful even when it wasn't fulfilled, was radical egalitarianism. Comrades were those not only courageous enough to practice a mode of belonging deeply at odds with the prevailing culture, but they were dedicated enough to recognize how personal relations help produce political power. So, I've tried to bring out the sort of utopian dimension of comradeship that follows from its etymology, that follows from how it's a term of address, that follows from the sort of expectations of equality that it carries. What I now want to do is start to contrast it with other forms of political belonging. So I'm going to emphasize differences between comradeship in 4 other forms: kinship, neighbors, citizens, and friends. Right? Comradeship is different from all 4 of those. So first, the relation between comrades is not a kinship relation. One is not born a comrade. It designates a relation that's different from the, let me go back to our kinship relations here. There's kinship relations. So kins may and do disagree with one another politically, right? That's what Thanksgiving is. Just making sure that, anyway, so that someone's related to you, that they're your brother, your child, your spouse, or whatever, tells you nothing about your politics. You have no idea. You can be spouses without being comrades. And then this is why I have Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. As Frida Kahlo famously says of Diego Rivera, whom she married twice, she says, Diego is not anybody's husband and never will be, but he's a great comrade. In her story of the British labor movement, Comrade or Brother, Mary Davis observes, comradeship builds on fraternity but transcends it. The ease of calling someone brother in predominantly male unions expresses solidarity, yet also gestures to the challenges labor has faced with respect to race and gender. To address another as comrade is not the same as addressing them as brother or sister, which immediately requires assigning a gender identity. Brother and sister rely on a familial imaginary, whether it's that of the nuclear family or the extended family that goes all the way to some kind of humanist brotherhood or family of man. Unlike these familial versions, where rivalry underlies the relation between brothers and sisters, and a desire to overturn, replace, and perhaps possess or devour infuses the child's relation with its parents, comrade denotes a flat equality and sameness, a kind of impersonality, and reciprocity. There's no desire to outdo or replace, but to support and be supported, right? Not to let down and not to be let down, right? There's a desire for collectivity that's different from the ways that familial relations work. Okay, what about neighbors? Comrade's not the neighbor. Living near somebody doesn't make them your comrade. You can be part of the same neighborhood, locality, community, tribe, without being comrades. Comradeship's not a spatial relation or an obligation that stems from shared locality. When the term's associated with communist, comrade actually has historically pointed to political mobility, right? Rootless cosmopolitanism, internationalism, motion. This non-localizability is part of what makes the comrades suspect, right? Comrades may well have tighter relations with those who are far away than they do with those who are right next door. The comrade's also not the same as the neighbor in the ethical sense, right, of love thy neighbor, right? You wouldn't say love thy comrade as thyself, because comrades don't love themselves, right? Comrades are not supposed to love themselves as like unique individuals, right? Comrades subordinate their individual preferences and proclivities to the political goals, right? Comrades' relations to each other are outward facing, oriented toward the project we are trying to achieve, the future we want to bring into being. Right? We cherish one another not for unique individuality, but for what we bring to the struggle. Comrade's also not the citizen. Right? The citizenship is a relation mediated by the state, and comradeship exceeds the state. It doesn't take the state as its frame of reference. Right? Comrade does not designate everyone born or residing in a specific territory. You find comrades all over the world. the early 20th century magazine that I mentioned a little bit ago, Comrade, it's super interesting on this score because one of the things, the features of the journal is collecting letters and speeches and articles and all sorts of writing by European socialists. And even though U.S. socialists at the time were not yet part of any kind of international political movement. Comrade's rupture of Citizen also manifests when we note how much the state fears communists as traitors, right? How much the state looks at communists as those who have loyalties to an organization that aims to overthrow the state. Rightly so. In the United States, during the Cold War, and still today in right-wing rhetoric, Comrade was used sarcastically and derogatorily to accentuate the dangerous otherness of communists. Comrade and Citizen thus stand in an antagonistic relation to one another, as the discipline of the comrade is substituted for the law of the state. Last example. The relation, or like I've done like neighbor and kin and citizen, now I'll do the last one of friends, right? Comradeship's not the same thing as friendship. And this is a really important point today, given the problem in left milieus that seem exclusive and cliquish. People who would otherwise be on the same side may not come together because of closed and unwelcoming friendship groups that prevent the generation of a sense of commonality and belonging. Conversely, personal animosities that destroy friendships can undermine the political work of comrades. And comrades might be friends, but friendship and comradeship are not the same. And we see this most clearly when friendships fray. Like, personal dislike does not mean that the person is not a comrade. Yeah, I mean, in tight, small associations, these overlap and they blur, and maintaining the difference and the distance is not easy. It takes a lot of work. But comradeship requires a degree of alienation from the needs and demands of personal life that friends have to attend to. All right, let me give an example here from the book Incognito by Frank Wilderson. Frank Wilderson's an Afro-pessimist theorist, and he was also involved in the armed struggle in South Africa. Wilderson describes long hours discussing politics and literature with Trevor, a white South African who was his student as well as his comrade in an underground MK unit. Wilderson writes, "I once told Trevor that he was the best friend I'd ever had. Trevor responded, 'I don't have friends, only comrades.'" Now, Wilderson says he didn't know what to make of this. We might consider that Trevor was rejecting the preferential singularity of friendship. He's rejecting this relation that dwells apart from politics. The absorbing work of political struggle creates its own intimacies, its own attachments and intensities. Comrades are bound through their work toward a common goal, not through something merely personal. Wilderson also reports on another conversation. This one is one he had with his first wife, Kanya, who's a black South African woman. Kanya says to Frank, "You have many white friends, but you hate them all." Comradeship abstracts from the specifics of individual lives, from the uniqueness of lived experience. But friendship doesn't. Right? Wilderson's friends remain white, and he remains black. He can hate the whiteness of his friends, and he can hate his friends for their whiteness in a way that is deeply personal, that's wrapped up in life and being. But comradeship's different. It's about the politics, the struggle, the discipline of common work, and the deep sense of connection and accountability that results. So this distinction between the comrade and the friend illuminates a kind of inhuman dimension to the comrade, right? Because comradeship has nothing to do with the person or personality in its specificity. It's generic. Comradeship abstracts from the specifics of individual lives to consider how these specifics might contribute to common goals, right? To collected ends. What matters is not the uniqueness of a skill or experience. What matters is its utility for party work. In this sense, the comrade is liberated from specificity. is freed by the common political horizon. The historian Ellen Schrecker makes this point in her magisterial account of anti-communism in the United States. During the McCarthy period of communist persecution, there was a common assumption that, quote, all communists were the same. Right? Communists were depicted as puppets, cogs, automatons, robots, even slaves. In the words of one of the McCarthy era's kind of professional witnesses, quote, people who became communists were no longer individuals but robots. They were chained in an intellectual and moral slavery that was far worse than any prison, end quote. There's a kind of truth that underlies these hyperbolic anti-communist claims. And the truth is this generic quality of comrades. The truth is of comradeship as a disciplined and disciplining relation that exceeds personal interest, right? Comradeship isn't personal, it's political. Okay, so I'm now going to move into this last section of the talk where I try to show why comrade is a better mode of political belonging for the left than allyship. Now, I would expect that most of y'all are probably familiar with the term ally as it circulates in contemporary activist circles, right? And kind of activist circles online and university campuses, right? It's used a lot, and it's super fraught, right? There's tons of intense discussions on social media and among community organizers about who can be an ally. Generally speaking, allies are understood as privileged people who want to do something about oppression. They may not consider themselves survivors or victims, but they want to help. So allies can be straight people who stand up for LGBTQ people. They can be white people who support black and brown people. They can be men who defend women, and so on. I've yet to see the term used for rich people involved in working class struggle. Allies don't want to imagine themselves as homophobic, racist, or sexist. They want to be the good guys, part of the solution. Now, again, and this is the way it's depicted in the struggle, right? I'm not saying that about would-be allies. I'm trying to give the picture of how the ally is presented as a figure in these debates. And as is frequently emphasized in these debates, claiming to be an ally doesn't make a person an ally, right? Allyship requires time and effort. People have to work at it. Much of the written and video work on allyship then is instructional, usually a list of pointers that tell people how to be an ally, the do's and don'ts, and so on. And the instructions are kind of like mini lifestyle manuals, like techniques for navigating but not demolishing settings of privilege and oppression. Individuals can learn what not to say and what not to do. They can feel engaged without any organized struggle at all. The politics in these allyship how-tos thus tends to consist of interpersonal interactions and individual feelings. The guide targets the potential ally's individual attitude and behavior, since that's what's supposed to change. I'm going to give a set of examples about this. Here's one from a BuzzFeed post titled, How to Be a Better Ally, an open letter to white folks. The text is from a letter sent by a producer of the BuzzFeed video series Another Round, and it's a reply to a question from a white person about being an ally. Quote, have you ever had a conversation with a feminist man come grinding to a halt because he starts to complain about how feminists use language that excludes men, even the feminist men? Not all men. I have, right, says the person, being a good ally often means not being included in the conversation because the conversation isn't about you. It's good to listen. If you feel uncomfortable and excluded because you're white, you should own those feelings. Okay. In this description, right, in this response, allyship is understood as a disposition. It's understood not as a confrontation with state or capitalist power. It's understood in terms of a confrontation with one's own personal discomfort. So to be an ally is to work on being a good listener, to step aside and become aware of the lives and experiences of others. Let me give you another example. And this is from an essay called The Fundamentals of Effective Allyship. And this was originally delivered as a talk at a tech inclusion event. And it considers allyship in terms of the intensity of the ally's feelings and whether the ally is willing and able to undertake the necessary self-work. Quote, "It's our responsibility to recognize, identify, and act on the privilege we have. One of the ways of doing so is committing to an ongoing act of introspection, reflection, and learning. You will feel yourself challenged, uncomfortable, even defensive. But the more intense these feelings are, the more likely it is you're on the right track," end quote. Acting on privilege here is something one does to oneself. So one's politics may be completely in one's head. In this respect, allyship reflects the shrinking of the space of politics to an individual's feelings. The field of action has decreased, yet the ally feels the need to act desperately, intensely, and now. And so they act on what's available to them, namely themselves and social media. Third example, and this is from the magazine Everyday Feminism.
Yeah.
So folks know this, yeah. So it's from a list of 10 things allies need to know. Number 5 on the list is allies educate themselves constantly. And here's the gloss on number 5. One of the most important types of education is listening. But there are endless resources, books, blogs, media outlets, speakers, YouTube videos, etc., to help you learn. What you should not do, though, is expect those with whom you want to ally yourself to teach you. That's not their responsibility. Sure, listen to them when they decide to drop some knowledge or perspective, but do not go to them and expect them to explain their oppression for you. Now, study is crucial for revolutionaries, but the vision of self-education associated with allyship is isolating. Learning is modeled as consuming information. It's not modeled as discussion. It's not modeled as coming to a common understanding. It's not modeled as studying the text of a tradition. Oh, no, I can't get my next page. What's going on? Education and educating oneself is disconnected entirely from a collective critical practice. It's detached from political positions or goals. The criteria that one might use by which to evaluate the books, blogs, speakers, and videos that we're instructed to consult, that's not provided, right? It's up to the individual ally to figure it out on their own. The would-be ally could be scolded and shamed, even as the scolder is relieved of any responsibility to provide concrete guidance and training. Because let's be clear, like telling someone to Google it is an empty gesture. Once we recall that ally is not a term of address, right? You don't say, "Oh, Ally John," right? It doesn't replace Mr., Ms., Dr., Professor. We can start to see how, in fact, allyship designates a limit, suggesting you'll never be one of us, rather than enabling solidarity. The relation between allies and those they are allies for is between those with separate interests, separate experiences, and separate practices, right? I mean, it's kind of no wonder we get this term like axis and allies, right? It's like little sovereign states making sure they protect their territory. One last example, because just in case the point's too vague here. The 8th item on Everyday Feminism's list of things allies need to know is allies focus on those who share their identity. Quote, "Beyond listening, arguably, the most important thing that I can do to act in solidarity is to engage those who share my identity," end quote. Identities here appear clear and fixed, unambiguous and unchanging. Individuals are like little sovereign states defending their territory and only joining together under the most cautious and self-interested terms. Those taken to share an identity are presumed to share a politics, as if the identity were obvious and the politics didn't need to be built. Those willing to forward a politics other than one anchored in what can easily be ascribed to their identity are treated with suspicion, mistrusted for their presumed privilege, and criticized in advance for the array of wrongs that preserve that privilege. The very terms of allyship reinforce the mistrust that the How to Be a Better Ally guides purport to address. Right, because it does make sense to mistrust people who view politics as immediate gratification, as an individualized quick fix to long histories of structural oppression. Because allies join together under self-interested terms, they can easily withdraw, drop out, and let us down. We can't be sure of their commitment because it hinges on their individual feelings and comfort. So item 8 in the Everyday Feminism article tells us why allyship has such a hold in progressive circles. Mistrust of other identities becomes functional and gratifying in the name of a politics that maintains and polices identity, our own special and vulnerable thing, helping us shore up its weak boundaries. Ally keeps attention away from the fearsome challenge of choosing a side, from accepting the discipline that comes from collective work, and from organizing the fight to smash capitalist imperialism and the divisive systems of bigotry and oppression that secure it. Allyship does not bridge political identities. It's a symptom of capitalism's attempt to replace politics with the techniques of individual self-help and social media moralism. The underlying vision is of self-oriented individuals, politics as possession, transformation reduced to attitudinal change, and a fixed naturalized sphere of privilege and oppression. Anchored in a view of identity as the primary vector of politics, the emphasis on allies displaces attention away from strategic, organizational, and tactical questions and onto prior attitudinal litmus tests, from the start precluding the collectivity necessary for revolutionary left politics. Now, let's be clear, on the left we need allies. Sometimes it's necessary to forge temporary alliances in order to advance. Communist struggle necessitates an array of tactical alliances among different classes, sectors, and tendencies. So this critique that I'm waging against the term ally is not a rejection of practices of alliance building, because that would be absurd. But allyship is not the form and model for revolutionary struggle against exploitation and oppression. As socialists and communists know, politics is always collective. The fiction that it is individual is nothing but capitalist ideology. The attachment to individual identity that underpins the politics of allyship is thus a form of political incapacity. Instead of building and working in organizations capable of revolutionary struggle, allies tend to concern themselves with defending their identities and lecturing others on how to aid in their defense. In contrast, because they embrace collective struggle, socialists and communists try to cultivate solidarity and comradeship. Okay, so let me sum up. I presented Comrade as a term of address, carrier of expectations in form of political belonging, as the egalitarian relation between those on the same side of a political struggle. I've contrasted the Comrade with 4 other forms of political belonging, right? Kin, neighbor, citizen, and friend. And I've argued that left struggle today requires that we be more than allies, that we be comrades. Comrades do more than express solidarity with the struggles of others. We take the struggle against oppression and for liberation, equality, and justice to be our struggle, to mark the side that we are on, to mark the politics that unites us. Commitment to this struggle makes comrades strong, and this strength means that together we will win. That's it.
We've got about an hour or so. People have questions for Jodi, and I'll let her, field them as she wishes. But please.
Sorry, put all my fingers.
transformational form in class society?
I think that even the language of socialist society always means that we have to still recognize that it will be a society with struggle that's going to be going on in it. So I want to kind of try to push away the thinking in terms of what does the ultimate victory look like. What is like the kind of heaven on earth? I think that that is so far away that doesn't really help us. So I firmly want to take it as a form of relation in struggle. And will that change over time? Probably, but I don't want to try to sort of name what will be there in the afterwards, right? Like, I mean, it's simply like who knows? Like in our, once we build communism, will we still have families? We don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. Will we be comrades in the sense of being on the same political side? Maybe, insofar as we will always have to struggle against forms of individual self-interest. Maybe because the struggle will be, long and hard. But so that's the way I think about it. Does that?
Yeah, I think so.
You want to follow up or push more?
Maybe it's
Okay.
I'll push back a little bit on
Okay.
that. One thing that I've seen, I'm a Trotskyist, so I've read James Buchanan's American Road to Socialism and some other things dealing with the transition. But usually when I've talked to comrades, they're very wary about, they're sort of like Marx, they're very wary about saying this is what communism will look like, which is fine. I don't need to know what the system will look like in 100 years. What I do need to know, though, is that after the revolution, we're not going to just recreate the Cheka and the KGB and make the exact same mistakes that Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot and what have you made. And I sometimes feel when leftists, especially revolutionary leftists, shy away from saying, well, I don't want to say exactly what tomorrow will look like, that we leave ourselves open to not discussing how we're going to avoid that shit.
Yeah.
And that I can see as a real problem. So I'm not so,
Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting question about Comrade as a form of address afterwards. And that's sort of an issue that I can sort of set aside. But I think at some point, not necessarily tonight, at some point, I really would love to read a collection written by revolutionaries of this is how we can avoid making the exact same errors that yada, 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 yada made.
I guess I have a few different, maybe sort of conflicting responses, but maybe we can also use this as like opportunity for collective struggle, right? I mean, collective struggle, collective discussion. Yeah, against the Trotskyist faction. No, joking, joke. But I mean, it doesn't have to be just like, one-on-one. Like other people might have like responses on this. So,
one thing I also want to mention is your talk, in terms of your talk, how much the current moment reminds me of the 1970s, the me decade. And how everything became about personal transformation and est and all that kind of stuff instead of transforming society. So on the one hand, I see that happening a lot, and also, because I'm not as young as I look, I'm seeing like identity politics, the second great wave of identity politics after like the late 1980s. The mid to late 1980s, which actually followed on an identity politics thing in the 70s also. And so now, it's like the wheel is turned again, and identity politics has come back for like the third time in my life.
Yeah, so I want to do the revolutionary violence question, and I think I guess I kind of think three things. I think like first, just like with an analogy, like. Most people, when they get married, don't say, gee, I really expect that we're just going to get divorced and hate each other like my parents did, right? And then they try. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And a whole bunch of different things can come in, like, horrible things can happen to that poor couple, and they split up. Or they may live a charmed life and nothing bad happens, and they still split up, right? Like, you can't predict the future. There are no guarantees in politics, just like there's no guarantees with our, hapless little married couple here. So I think we've got to not demand of ourselves something like a kind of guarantee that is impossible, and then we got to stop beating ourselves up for that as well, right? I think that's really, really crucial. I also think this may be an unpopular opinion, and I guess it's getting recorded, but we also shouldn't. I mean, as things get worse, it's not all going to be peaceful struggle. And, you know, I think that to try to avoid extremes, to try to avoid not enjoying violence, that's important. I think discipline is really crucial on this, and discipline training is really crucial.
Amen.
So that would be the other. I'm gonna stop on ahead on this one. I have a lot of support this time. Andy?
I'm reminded of the 1970s.
Yep. What's that?
I'm reminded of the 1970s too, when I really wanted to be a comrade, and I actually couldn't get it together to be one. And partly it was my fault, you know, being an independent leftist, and a friend of mine once said, there's no such thing as an independent leftist. But it was also the fault, I think, of the Times, which my experience of it in Philadelphia in the late 1970s was not of the new generation, but of the formation of all the little grouplets that shook out of the SDS. There was more movement than, you know, the various new communists and socialist movements that were emerging out in the 1960s.
You just say, that's what I actually, what I thought he was saying at first until we went to the meeting. I was on that track. That's what I thought.
So this is where the idea of comrade, you know, was present to me, you know, in my memory. And to be a comrade in that context was to join an organization. And it was to join an organization that had, and you talk about this in the book as well, that has a vertical structure and not just a horizontal structure that requires, that demands obligations of its members and loyalty. And it has the expectation of building something that's more than just a movement or an organization, but a party. And that whole party building sort of history was a catastrophic failure at the end of the 1970s, as I'm sure you know. And I have a problem with the concept of it at the moment. I mean, there's one thing forming a, whatever we may call the DSA. I'm a member of DSA, I'm a member of DSA. But I don't consider myself a comrade in the sense that you mean it. Because I think the obligation that I have to DSA, which is almost nothing, is paying my dues, is different from what you're talking about. When as the slides were flashing by, I saw Che Guevara, the advocate of revolutionary love, saying that as long as you feel the same indignation as I do against injustice, you are my comrade. That's not what I think of comrade is.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think I think Fidel had a different idea of comradeship, and that's why Che ended up in Bolivia and dead. And it involves the things that I think never really got off the ground in the United States. And I think that kind of meaning is problematic, because it requires an organization, and it requires a hierarchy, and it requires a program that we don't have. So we can't just declare ourselves comrades. We can declare ourselves allies, but we can't declare ourselves comrades. And there, I'd like you to address that. Okay, where do we go from here? With finding ourselves as comrades, right? Where do we find the places in which we can be comrades? Those rooms, the vaults, the organizational structures. Because I don't think they're there.
There are some there. So you join them or you build a new one. But you recognize that no one can be a leftist by themselves.
Yeah, well, that's what people said to me in the 1970s, but...
And
yeah, but wait, okay, but Jodi, I mean, the earlier question from the Trotskyists down the road here is the right one, because the organizational demands at the time of, you know, of party building and making revolution are the same ones that become the authoritarian problems of the post-revolutionary period.
I think that's I think that's a crazy jump, right? To say like the tiny sectarian groups that split apart are the same as the Bolsheviks who seized a party. Like, I mean, who seized the state, right? Who carried out a successful revolution. Those are not the same things. Those are different things. So that's one thing. Let's not throw it all in together. I mean, I know that your politics are generally good, Andy, so this is not, but I think that participates in an anti-communist imaginary to dump that stuff all together. I think that we don't do ourselves any favors with that kind of sweeping them all together. I think we do better to talk about you know, the fact that small groups may not be attractive, that they can splinter, that those are issues, and we can talk about those. And I think we can talk about, you know, what does it mean to seize a state, and how much revolutionary violence in the seizure of a state and the building of a new society is tolerable, and how do we avoid its successes? That seems like a separate question, right? But like groups of 15 students is not the same thing as a massive system.
But I'm not saying that. Of course I'm not saying that. My experience, my point of comparison is with the PCF in France, or the LFI, Jean Mélenchon's group, where party organization actually means something. There's an existing institutional structure in which party comes into existence, one we don't have. And there is, and party organization actually means a level of achievement and a set of tasks that are collective, that are already prepared for the person who joins the organization.
So, we can, your view then leads to a place where it says your only options in the United States, if you're going to be in a political party, are to be in the mainstream. I reject that. I don't think those are the only options. There are small parties, there's pre-party formations, right? There are other groups that are not quite parties, but are militant left organizations. And if you know, the people who consider themselves independent leftists stop being independent and actually participated in disciplined struggle, things might look different, right? If all, I gotta say, if all of the academics who act so radical actually did something, right? Oh my God. That would be something. That would be something.
Jodi, this is the conversation that I had in the 70s, and maybe you did too.
You did.
Okay, so it's a repeated conversation. But don't dismiss all the academics as if they don't do anything.
Okay, let's see, we'll have other hands. We'll come back to this. Yeah.
Cool. I am one of those academics who totally dismiss us for the worst. And I'm in DSA too, and you're right, the National sucks, which is why my local chapter is basically like, fuck all them, we're doing our own thing. And it's awesome. We're like a pirate democracy, we're trying to put together the Connolly Social Club. Because you're right, like, I think we find ourselves in this moment where no one's gonna save us, and we have to build stuff from scratch, we shouldn't have to, but like, you know, life sucks, get a helmet. That being said, what I'm really interested in, both is kind of like, you know, watching the folks in the DSA forums sort of like lose their minds slowly, that there's this intense loneliness wherein comradeness becomes to function to fill emotional like needs that people have, as opposed to being a designation of a shared struggle, right? And that's sort of the kind of question I have, and I really love the talk. I think it's like really interesting. I think I like the fact that I feel alienated from this kind of this kind of idea of comrade, because like, yeah, it's what I'm seeing is this gap between emotional needs and like a political project. But do you think that there is enough space and will to engage in that, in intense, what can be very intense alienation, given that these other needs aren't met? Can one pierce through that into achieving something else in your broader community, or do you see that like folks are going to need to like wait and just kind of suck it up for the time being and work on the project?
I'm not 100% sure I fully understand the question, so let me try answering, and then you might correct me. So what I hear you saying is that don't people come into politics for their own emotional reasons, and that can be a problem? Is that their own, like they've got to, basically they're kind of lonely losers and they join a group because maybe I'll make friends?
I'm not saying that like isn't that the case, but given that the current situation makes that highly, likely, does that put up like does that pose a problem for this kind of political project?
I want to say two things. I think first, on the left, we need everybody we can get, right? One. Second thing is, because all we have is people, in other words, we don't have the money, we don't have the guns, right? We don't have the, or not enough, we don't have the institutions. We have people, and so we've got to kind of, those are the resources. We got to cherish those resources. We got to build and train those resources. And if, why people come into it, that doesn't really matter, right? I mean, but we got to do is to like support them and build them up for the sake of the struggle. Right? So one of the things, like, I'm not DSA, I'm in a different group, and we think that, in fact, people who come into the party need to go through a period of training, and that's an important thing. So it's more than just paying your $20 and calling yourself a member.
Candidates.
Yeah, we have candidate programs. Yeah.
This isn't so much a question as a comment. Just what you said reminded me of Jonathan Matthew Smucker's book. I don't know if you've read that or not. Hegemony How To, I think he calls it. And he comes from a similar background that I do, which is like I grew up in the church, in a sort of lefty church, and then left it. You know,
That's kind of left.
it's how it happens, right? But I think that there are a lot of similarities, and what the sort of analogy he makes is that people came into the left under Bush too because of that social and personal and spiritual need, right? So like your first arrest was like a baptism, and it's like you become part of this community and suddenly you're blessed and you have this, and it seems, thinking about that I can see where you're coming from, that it can become an obstacle to comradeship, right? But maybe it's just like a phase, that you have to get that spiritual satisfaction in some way. But then I guess the challenge is, how do you deepen that? Like, how do you let people not stop there? And it seems like that's a similar thing to being an ally, right? Like, okay, I've got this stamp on me, I'm wearing a safety pin, I'm good. Like, I feel good, and so how do we move deeper?
If we're going to use the religious analogies, it's a question of works, not faith.
Right.
Right? It's the practice, it's doing the work. Mm-hmm. And that's the day in, day out, super tedious selling of the newspaper and going door to door, and recognizing that struggle and like doing this stuff builds its own kind of intimacy that's just not the same thing as the interpersonal part, right? It's the work builds this sense of collective struggle that's strong and great. But if folks aren't doing the day-to-day stuff, it's not going to feel like that.
But
it's going to feel like nothing.
That affect or that emotion can still be a bait then, right? I mean, it can still be a reason that you do it, but like, hey, let's do it even more. Like you're going to feel even better about your community if you deepen that relationship beyond just like having, being baptized or whatever.
I'm sure. I guess
My partner's going to disagree with
for
me.
me, I'm not so like I worry about too much of the religious analogy to be really
Yeah, I mean,
honest.
I wouldn't say, I think I took it too far, but, I think there is a sense of personal isolation.
We live under, decaying, horrifying, intensifying capitalism, and so alienation is part
Right.
of our basic condition.
And I guess what I'm asking is the need to not have that an obstacle, or is it a possible obstacle if it's left at a certain level? Does that make any sense?
I mean, the answer is, it's dialectical. It's going to be both, right? And the important thing about comradeship is it's not like what your emotions are about something. It's that someone's got to make the damn banner.
Right.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
that's just what it is. Yeah.
I find, aspects of your analysis really useful, especially like the sort of dismissiveness of the social media organizing or the kind of very individual group thing. I would posit that, and you probably wouldn't disagree with me actually, that a part of that is this epoch that we live in since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which has witnessed a real descent into obscurantism, in which the whole sort of Enlightenment project is being challenged. And a part of this is these things are very abstractly internalized, and there isn't a projection outward. There isn't a materialist conception. It's a very idealist, like this is my personal oppression that I'm struggling against, or this is my personal outrage at this or that. And what I would say to address the comrade and the concerns he raised earlier about the splintering of groups is that sort of the project of rebuilding the left has to be based on an actual struggle for program. And that it doesn't surprise me that in an atomized period, you have lots of small groups. But I think what the solution to that is not to abandon the idea that we should have a program and that we should even struggle against each other with our own comrades for that program. Because I think when you look at the broad scope of history, this is something Trotsky says in his History of the Russian Revolution, but it's also an observation you can find from Grant about the US Civil War and about participants in the French Revolution, is that when actual historical activities are in motion, like a few days capture
Yeah.
the changes of years, right? And these things that are differences now we can't predict what they are, just like we can't predict what the future society will look like. But the things that are secondary will fall away when we are actually in a confrontation, and groups will fuse together. Like there'll be a sorting out of, of the right program. And I don't think that the programmatic differences are trivial. If you look at things that groups have fought over, like just to take one, for example, Hungary in 1956. Like, are you for the state that's coming down and crushing the protesters, or are you for the protesters in the street, right? I mean, there were communists on both sides of that, and you really shouldn't be in the same group papering over differences. Those are split differences. Some of these things are split differences, but in the course of class struggle, I think what's a secondary difference and what's a real difference will get sorted out.
I think you made some really great points. I want to just pick up on one of them, and that is, and this is because I'm trained as a political theorist and like do academic political theory, and one of the things that I find super frustrating about it is that the academics will say, right, so they will take this meta view and say, so it's really a democratic struggle, and any one of those little sectarian ones, anyone could be right, and what really matters is letting them all have their say. And my view is no, you pick a side and you fight for it. And that there's the meta level, fact that that it will sort itself out, right? Like no, some people, like the good guys can lose, right? Like we might lose. And so we have to fight. We can't just stand back and let the fray happen as if we're above it all. So I'm agreeing with you, but I just want to make sure that like the meta level isn't the one where people stay, just like, well, good, let all the little groups stay and then I can pick after it all happens. It's like, no, you got to get in there and fight. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to put you in the position of being a self-help guru. Replacing the other one, I think we might be in danger of putting you there. But I seem to put like kind of like a finer point on what's already been said. Is that like it's deeply embarrassing to admit that you were wrong after you posted like 9 everyday feminism articles on your Facebook, right? And then you're like, oh, well, actually, maybe allyship's not the best way to go about doing this. Right, like, is it just now inviting someone to do the work with you that lets them like admit that they were wrong and go do something different, or is there something else that we should be doing to say that the door is open, stop being ally, and start being a comrade?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm also interested in how other people will respond to that. I mean, to be really honest, in practice, I don't think that we have to get out of, I don't think we should beat each other up over language, right? Which has happened way too much in social media. But I think what we have to do is show it in practice. And then if someone says, oh, starts to say like one-on-one about using allies, start to say, well, I think we're more, right? I think something more here is involved. Rather than like social media can't be our horizon, it can't be our primary terrain. And when we get out of that framework and then do the practical work, then we're in a better shape. So that would be the way I would start approaching it. And then, actually, one of the things that I like about being in a disciplined party is you learn, like, you know what? I don't have to talk about stuff on social media. It doesn't matter, right? I don't need to go out there. Like having some kind of discipline on on you right there is actually really useful. It can protect you from your worst attributes. Yeah, did you?
Yeah, I kind of want to spin off of like David's question and sort of think about the posting of cringe on the timeline is far more forgivable than other things that potential comrades or even maybe actual comrades have done. But yet there's also, I don't want to give any oxygen to the notion of like cancel culture or whatever. But I mean there is an absence of forgiveness and redemption, on the left, and at the same time, of that, another tension in dialectic. There's also just things that are just, sins that are just deeply horrifying, and how do we deal with that, I think it's particularly in the, it's a question of the long term and also the near term, because I think there are people do things or have done things, and these things come to the surface, and these are things in their past, oftentimes, maybe sometimes they're in the near past or the far past. But like at the same time, we have to also allow for forgiveness and redemption, and how do we do that, you know, in a way that doesn't, like, oh, you know, at the same time, like, gloss over those acts?
Yeah, it's a really hard, real question. You know, I've been spending some time reading Krupskaya's Reminiscences of Lenin, which is a really wonderful book. And one of the things that she talks about is the way that, you know, Lenin would get into real arguments with people. And unless it was a real matter of fundamental principle, like, they could just, like, go on and on and on. And then the next day be like, oh, we really need that guy's help, or that comrade's help, and go on with it, right? That was like, there's some matters of real principle that you can't go back on. But remember, like, how you might, like, you know, it's not, again, this isn't a religion. And so the forgiveness, you can personally forgive someone, that doesn't mean you gotta work with them politically. Or you can, you know, not forgive someone and still work with them politically. All of that is different. I mean, like, I don't know, I had a very good friend who's also a comrade say something unbelievable, like one of the worst things anyone's ever said to me this fall. It was awful. It was really awful. Like, I'll tell you what it was. She said I was not a team player.
Oh, I thought you were, yeah, I mean, not bad, but.
This was, I mean, I'm still really upset about it. And, I mean, I couldn't believe it. And it escalated too quickly for me to, like, address it in a calm and patient way, to say, you know, why did you say this? Is there something else going on? Like, which is what I should have done. So it just sort of festered. But we got work to do, you know? So we're not friends anymore, but damn, don't we do the work, right? That's the only thing that matters, you know? Will we be friends in the future? I don't know. But for the political stuff, I know what, you know, I know that I can count on her. She knows that she can count on me on some political things. And the other stuff, it's like, it's time, you know, a few weeks went by before I felt like I could deal with it, and at that point it's too late. So, you know, so this sort of shit will keep going on. That's it. Again, reading these Reminiscences of Lenin are so great, because, like, you see the toll of interpersonal squabbling and bickering that it takes on Lenin. Like, it's always happened. There's Congress coming up. Lenin's like doesn't sleep for days. He's a wreck, and then, you know, it's all invested, and then they have to, like, go to the mountains for 6 weeks and hike because he pulls himself together. Or, like, you know, he goes to the beach and sleeps for 4 days. Like, but this is happening over and over and over again. Like, as just the tensions of political work and party building, it's awful. But you do the work, then you recover, and you go back. And it's sort of like, I really think this is part of why Comrade, the figure of the Comrade is so important and useful for us, is because it makes us think instrumentally about ourselves in the political struggle, not personally and psychologically and emotionally and all that. I mean, the passion is for the fight and the win, not for the, oh, you hurt my feelings.
Yeah. Great talk. Thank you for that. I think, you know, there's a lot to gain from the idea of self-criticism as well. And breaching that boundary with your friends and comrades can be difficult. You really have to trust each other and not consider it a personal attack. But there is a need to criticize each other. And if you think somebody's being wrong, you need to say it. That's really important in organizing. As for some of the other discussion, you know, I'm part of a very small collective in Albany. We have about 15 members, but I call them all comrades. Even those who have left, I refer to as my comrades. You know, I trust these people in the struggle. If you're in a big tent org like DSA, I can see that being difficult. I'm in a pretty small party, and my collective is basically, you know, within a square 2-mile radius. But, you know, once you get to know each other and building those social connections, you can actually call each other comrades and, you know, work together, even if it's like a small thing. Like in Albany, what we do is, you know, it's not going to change the world, but we are trying to change the community despite our differences, and, like, you know, building organizational ties with, say, the Green Party or DSA. I don't personally agree with their politics, but at the same time, they are comrades in the struggle, and if you're turning out together, that's all you can ask for.
Yeah, I'm just curious what you think about the whole binary, gender, what's your pronouns business? I mean, what is your thoughts on that in relation to the concept of comrade?
So this, I'm glad you asked this. One of the, I don't know how many of y'all saw the clips from the DSA, was it called convention or Congress? What y'all call it? A convention that were circulating, like the right was circulating them online. And there were people calling for what point of personal privilege, and some of the language was, some of the aggravation was about people using gendered language from the podium. And there was some members of the organization who were really unhappy about that. And what they asked for was to be called Comrade. Like, you know, folks, if you say Comrade, you don't have to use gendered language. I thought that was great. I thought that was wonderful. Now, you know, because I mean, honestly, it doesn't, I mean, if it makes someone feel more welcome and happy to be called Comrade and to not use gendered language, why shouldn't I respect that? I mean, I think I should. Right? I think that's important. If it's going to help us build a group and collective, let's do it. You know, if that's what will make people feel more comfortable, then let's do it. I don't think that we should. I think that we should pick our battles about what kind of principles we want, and one of them needs to be to make sure that everyone who's coming into the struggle who wants to be on our side and shows commitment, you know, has a space. And I think Comrade is the kind of, you know, general relation of supporting cover that can do that. So yeah. So that's where I'm on the gender thing. That's, I don't know if I had it in this one, but I usually have a slide that's like my favorite gender neutral pronoun. Yeah, is Comrade. But Peter.
I finally have a follow-up question. In your talk and then in your previous book, Proud to be Party, you kind of have here a discussion of a comrade who says, well, I don't really want to do it, but I'm going to sell the Daily Worker, right, because I have to. And then, you know, so reading Proud to be Party, which I think is a very important, interesting work, especially you bring up Robert Michel's. I study Robert Michel's, and I thought one of the problematics when you're talking about Comrade is a question of at what point is it okay to dissent? At what point do we have to worry about that kind of obedience to authority that Michel talks about in the construction of kind of this comradeship in a party? Because I think it is an important question as we try to build a mass party. You know, I mean, I agree with you in terms of the necessity of building one, and I think Michel did as well. But you know, just as, I mean, selling the Daily Worker is one thing, but if you have a real problem with, say, self-criticism, because I was reading, you put, in Proud to be Party, you kind of put someone, I think there's a self-criticism section, and that might be a healthy thing for comrades to be in there, but it can also be unhealthy. So how do we kind of make those distinctions, especially as we're building these large organizations that do have hierarchies? I guess curious what you have to say.
I guess I think a few things on that. I think that first, there's not going to be guarantees, right? We can't make guarantees about those things, right? We just, you know, particularly because people have different kind of levels of toleration for criticism, for example. You know, so I think to say that there's one principle actually makes me feel like this is like liberals. Like we need to have liberal rules and procedures to make these things kind of you know, get them all cleared up. And I just don't think that's the way political organizations actually work. So in fact, I think that a principle of comradeship makes us have to recognize that we need everyone in the struggle, and that we need to keep focused on the goal. And that with that should be at least a beginning framework. Now, what else do we need? We need to be effective actors. We're going to need a degree of unity. So in your meetings and organizing, do you try to foster unity? Or do you foster, say, debate for its own sake, right? Like coming at it, like academia, we're used to arguing about a text just for its own sake, right? Like, oh, my interpretation is cooler and blah, blah, blah. But like, what's going to be more functional for the struggle? And do we really need to have those kinds of debates over texts in party organizing? Like, I actually don't think so. Sometimes we will, right? Like, for example, do you want to do you want to let in a whole zillion people without going through candidacy or not, right? There are reasons sometimes that the party does that and reasons it doesn't. Or something like, do we expel members for rape? Do we expel members who are racist? Right? What do we expel? Like, expulsion's a real thing. I actually think it's good. I think that it's wrong to think that you can have a militant revolutionary party based on solidarity and comradeship if you're not willing to take a stand on kinds of actions that are permissible within the group. So, I think that's just, that's determined within the, the party itself determines that kind of thing. Does that not, I bet that doesn't answer what you want though.
I mean, I think it does to an extent, but also in terms of kind of, levels of dissent, especially from a majority of, say you have a majority of comrades who are acting and behaving in a particular way. You and maybe a minority of your comrades disagree. You may not disagree about the fundamental principles of the party, but the actions the party is taking. I know that there's always a debate over democratic centralism, but at what level it should dissent within comrades be allowed? I guess that's kind of more of what I'm getting at, and I think leans on more than Michelle's angle, because there could be a tendency within a revolutionary party to just say, yeah, you don't agree with us on this, get out, right? But that may not be what they want.
Yeah, but a revolutionary party is not a debating club.
No.
And it's what is the purpose of the group? Is it for everyone to be able to express their opinion and to try to cultivate their individuality? Or is it to try to act as a unified group? Right? I actually think democratic centralism is a very good form of democracy. I think that we shouldn't underestimate the Democratic Party, the democratic aspect of it, because people can quit. Right? People can leave. Right? It's not like you're forcing people to be in the doggone party, which is so small.
Right.
But I think that to be able to, I think that to have a unity of action makes sense, because otherwise your group can't do anything.
Thank you for an interesting presentation, and the discussion's been lively. I've had a little trouble seeing what the goal, the purpose of the organization is. But you say revolutionary socialism.
Or communism.
Revolutionary communism. So that means the overthrow of the bourgeois state.
Yes.
Okay, it seems to me that the Marxist sort of 19th and early 20th century tradition tried to do that. That includes bad old people like Mao. That they took very seriously this idea that you're going to have to know who fundamental class enemies are. And as I think Marx said, you have to be able to put the sort of blue heel on their throat. So that's something really quite grand for Americans to think about, because our country has been sort of like in reaction for about 2.5 centuries of its existence in terms of revolutionary movements or insurrectionary movements anywhere. So it seems to me it's sort of very difficult to move beyond this kind of how nice or unnice do we have to be to each other. I don't sort of see necessarily the value of selling the newspaper unless you know what the purpose of that newspaper is for. And then that's going to itself take a political discussion about kind of both philosophical and strategic goals. But we're sort of ridiculously inexperienced at, because in a sense they haven't been on anybody's agenda for decades.
So I think that doesn't describe the world that I see. Right? I see a United States that had a vigorous communist milieu in the 30s and 40s and even into the 50s, a milieu so vigorous that communists were deported, that they were arrested, that there were hearings on them. I see a communist milieu that continues to haunt the far right so much that they even called Barack Obama a communist. So I see a vision of the and I also see a vision of the United States that has had multiple vigorous left movements struggling and trying to establish themselves and spread.
And what has happened to that?
A lot of it is still there, and in fact, a lot of it's growing. DSA right now is the biggest it's ever been. We've seen waves of different kind of left action. Let's just to be very brief, the Occupy, Black Lives Matter. We've seen the fight against incarceration, the carceral state, aggressive policing. That's been increasing. We've seen the Poor People's Campaign is increasing. The environmental movement is increasing. I think trans rights is on the table. That's a big deal. right? So I don't just see a vision of the US that is only some kind of story of the triumphant bourgeoisie. I see struggle also happening in part of this story. And the goal of the left is to amplify, build, and expand this struggle.
I will grant you that you've had sort of upsurges from below, popular forces, whatever you want to call them. But when has the bourgeoisie been shaped? By the French Revolution, by the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union, by the Chinese Revolution, even by the Socialist Party of Chile.
The late 1960s.
When has it been shaken where it actually sort of lost its positions of power and control? Not that they had to sort of bring the soldiers home to pacify the sort of domestic situation, which is what the reference to the 60s is about.
So is your point that change has not occurred, so it never can?
No, my change is that in the U.S., change has not occurred, and as fundamental sort of shifts toward a left possibility have never occurred. And therefore, I think we're particularly prone to feel like that sort of contemporary capitalism leaves us atomized, because there's been a very strong right for a very long time that's worked, for instance, to sort of attack and weaken a labor movement in this country quite successfully.
But also
So
a
that
very
means
precious
sort of
red thread.
existence for the sort of conditions for struggle are very, very, very different.
Sure,
here
they're
than they are in a
different.
lot
We
of
also have
places.
seen, I've been very impressed with the teacher strikes over the last year. That's been really impressive, the nurses' strikes. So I think that, you can tell a story of capitalism triumphant and the oppressive nature of the sort of, white patriarchal capitalist state, and that won't be wrong. But if you miss the struggle underneath, then you miss the whole story. We've got other people who
Yeah,
want to
and
speak.
sorry, I intervene in this. We've got time for a couple more. Is there anybody who hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet, or
make a
a comment? Yeah, that was like a chance. Please, yeah.
Sorry if you addressed this earlier. I was just having some difficulty understanding how you can like transition from an ally to a comrade if you're kind of inherently privileged and you really have like no skin in the game. Could you kind of address that?
Yeah, so being a comrade is not about it's not about the comrade's identity. It's about the comrade's political action and what they're willing to do. If you are, so you can, you join a revolutionary socialist party or even DSA, and you
You're right.
You can get involved in action. It's not about who you are in terms of some kind of identity. What matters is what is the action you're willing to fight for.
So is the only difference then just your intent on actual action?
No, it's about whether or not you think that identity gives you your politics.
Yeah. But it gives you your experience, doesn't it? So what do you do with that? How can comradeship, I'm asking honestly, how can comradeship overcome power differentials? How do we do that?
Through action. I guess in some ways, I feel like the tendency is to try to turn it back into interpersonal things rather
I don't
than.
think identity isn't impersonal. I think identity is collective, but they're different collectives. And I have power that somebody else doesn't have, right? That I didn't earn.
So the comradeship is a relation of equality. And
How does that happen?
Doing the work.
It's through the work. I'll just give an example from, our party was holding a park in DC because the KKK was gonna rally in Washington. And so everybody, was summoned to DC. And then it's like, what is the goal? The goal is holding the park. What does that mean? It means that we have to make sure that people are not on top of the buildings and that there is not a lot of trash. If not, the police will shut it down. And so that means, we got a stage. We want to have people on the stage in order to make sure that people now come into the park to hold it, to be against the KKK. So every comrade had different jobs. It's like, you're on security, you have to talk you have to pick up garbage, you have to, try to herd people over here. But there was no priority, like, to have to talk on the stage didn't mean you were like the big speaker. It meant that somebody has to do it, and we gotta occupy the damn stage for 4 hours. So come on, you're scared, sorry, practice over here with this person. You're done, okay, now go security. So all of the different positions on this, in this work, are equal, right? There's no kind of privilege on this. Now, are we having a deliberative debate and a discussion and voting on who's gonna do what? No, it's a democratic centralist party. It's like, here's the goal, here's the roles. Do this, do this, do this. And everyone's like, great, I'm so glad someone told me what to do because I'm sick of deliberating about this kind of stuff. Right? But everybody's equal. Does that give some illustration? Does that
It
help a
illustrates
little?
how that works during an event. I don't know that it illustrates how it works in the day-to-day.
Day to day, you go to the doggone branch meetings, you vote on things, you have to practice comradeship, which also means that you try to make sure that you have a progressive stack, that you don't take up too much space in the room, that you try to keep things calm to build unity if necessary, that you work on combating kinds of hierarchy. Like in our group, having several people with PhDs is not good, right? That's always bad in a collective. And so, you gotta, you're aware of that and you work on mitigating that. But there are like 3 other people who want to hear, so I'm gonna shut up and let the other people say something and then maybe close.
So I just want to say, okay, let's look at specifics. Say you have a group of women, or a group of people, of immigrants, or a group of people of color, or a group of trans people, or whatever. So how do you how does one who does not have that background or that identity be a comrade in those situations? I mean, isn't it good for the people who have that particular type of oppression or identity make their own decisions?
So you're beginning within the framework of identity formations and allyship.
Well, and see,
right,
so
that's the way
that's
it's
the way
starting.
everything is going on these days. So and I won't give specifics, but I was attacked for writing about a particular group by someone repeatedly. In fact, actually, it was at the level of harassment. That I was not in this, I do not have this identity, I can't have any interest in it, I can't be supportive, I cannot be outraged, it is not okay.
So,
And it was like, very interesting.
that doesn't surprise me. In the milieu of identity formations, folks are protecting their turf.
Yes.
That's not a surprising thing.
No.
But there are also other kinds of political groupings that are not based on identity, that are forwarding a communist politics or a socialist politics, and that work to bridge connections within their group, to make sure that everyone's focused on the goal, and that things that would be sort of forms of identitarian hierarchy and exclusion are not there, right? You still have to combat that, right? You make sure that, like, I don't know, like you make sure that you really create an inclusive environment.
Okay, so let's go back to labor. So if you have a group of people who work in a particular industry, particular sector, or a particular employer, are they able to form this group and make their own decisions? I mean, it's often called a union.
A union is not the same thing as a party.
No, I understand that, and I'm not in the world of parties, but I am in the world of activism, and I do believe in solidarity. So I'm confused about how to proceed and what to look for.
So I'm making an argument that is fundamentally about the importance of the party form for left politics. And that's the basic premise.
Okay.
And part of that then is to also describe the relations of those in the party or those on the same side of a political struggle for communism, right? Not a political struggle for recognition in the framework of liberal bourgeois rights.
Okay.
Not a struggle for recognition before the Labor Review Board or Labor Relations Board, right? Those are important struggles. But those are not the ones that I'm describing. They are different kinds of struggles. And I think that what we need actually as a focus in the era of extreme inequality and climate change is communism as a horizon and a building of a kind of collectivity and solidarity with that as the goal.
So we can take one more.
Are there, I think there are comments.
Or, yeah.
I'm just standing, shifting my seat.
Oh. To answer the comrade over there about when was the last time the American bourgeoisie
I
was
don't
kind
think
of,
he's a communist.
well,
I mean, like, seriously.
the brother, actually for the Connolly Forum, the brother. The late 60s. Lewis Powell was later appointed to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. Before that, he was the chief counsel for the American Chamber of Commerce. And he wrote a memo outlining basically the neoliberal program that the American bourgeoisie needed to implement to break the labor movement, break the revolutionary left, and get past what seemed to the American bourgeoisie a pre-revolutionary moment in the late 60s, early 70s. So that's the last time that the American bourgeoisie felt that worried. 50 years later, the neoliberal project is intellectually bankrupt, intellectually exhausted. It's just like the New Deal consensus was basically intellectually exhausted by the end of the 1970s. And Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher put the knives into, and then Clinton and Bush, finished the burial, and then the Great Recession in 2008. So we are in a moment now where neoliberalism is dying and roads are opening, in part thanks to Bernie Sanders' campaigns, DSA, the teacher strikes, which were clearly influenced and by Sanderism and what have you, where we now have a moment to challenge the neoliberal, the Walking Dead neoliberal model. And from a political standpoint, frankly, Bernie Sanders might be this generation's Ronald Reagan, and that's sort of the difference, the shift from New Dealism to neoliberalism, back to New Dealism, but possibly opening up more. Just briefly on the whole comrades and what have you, self-criticism, I generally think, is a really sucky way of doing organizing within revolutionary parties. I haven't been in a revolutionary party in 30 years, so I'm a bad Trotskyist. But my old party, in response to an incident of racism, has a method for dealing with that incident, correcting the behavior, and then moving on. So you don't have to expel it. I mean, we're all a bunch of freaking labor activists. We believe in progressive discipline. Aside from rape and a few other types of crimes, there really shouldn't be immediate expulsions. You try to correct the behavior, and if the behavior can be corrected, great, move on. If it can't be corrected, then you expel the person. But when it comes to working together, there are ways to put into practice good ways of doing criticism. I lived through some feminist organizing in the 80s and 90s where, well, if you have a problem with that, then you should just do it yourself. And that kind of praxis drove me up the wall, because sometimes something really doesn't, if the flyer needs to be criticized, you fucked up, fix it. And if you criticize it at all, you're shouted down. We can't allow that, but then the whole self-criticism thing can just become malice bullshit.
Oh, actually, I don't have a grand last word. I have like detailed last words. Like one of the things I also think though about, say, arguing about the flyer is like, does anything really rise and fall if there's a mistake in the flyer? Like, maybe not. Like, so part of what we have to do is know which fights are really worth having in our branch and which ones are like, next week, this is not going to matter. Right? Next week, this is not going to be a big deal. It's easy to get too preoccupied with the little and not see the big, and like mistreat your comrades because you're too focused on the little.
But it can also allow just error to build upon error to build upon error if you don't have that way of correcting behavior or correcting things. And, you know, error, it gets bigger and bigger.
So it's not lost on me that it's another person with a PhD telling you all to shut up and thank you all for the spirited conversation. My understanding, thank you, Jodi, for great talk and sort of invigorating the conversation. The conversation, though, does continue at the ale house, is that correct?
Damn right.
Okay. So,
And Jodi's book is in the back.
yeah.
Yeah.
With her.